The cold barrel of the gun pressed relentlessly against Lena Whitaker's temple as she knelt on the rain-soaked asphalt, her wrists bound tightly behind her back with plastic zip ties. Blood from her split lip dripped steadily onto her cream blazer, mixing with the rainwater that drenched her clothes. Officer Bryce Harlan's boot ground harder into her spine, forcing the air from her lungs in shallow, desperate gasps. She could barely breathe. In the distance, sirens wailed, growing closer with every passing second. Behind Harlan, the young officer Mateo Rivera leaned in with urgent whispers. Backup was coming. They might be making a terrible mistake. They needed to know who this woman really was. But Harlan only pushed the gun harder against her head and growled that no one was coming to save her. The events that brought her to this moment had unfolded with terrifying speed. Lena had been driving her unmarked silver sedan along the winding back roads of the Georgia County, her heart light with the thought of returning to her husband Julian after a demanding stretch away. As the first black woman to lead the FBI, she carried enormous responsibilities. Yet in that moment, all she wanted was to be home, to feel Julian's arms around her, to set aside the weight of her title and simply be his wife for a quiet weekend. Her phone rested in the cup holder. She had just ended a warm call with him, laughing about dinner plans and how much she missed his cooking. Julian had left the FBI some years earlier and now served as police chief in this quiet county where they had built their home beside the lake. Their marriage had lasted many years, and the sound of his voice still made her smile. She had told him she would be home soon, that she loved him, that she could not wait to be only his wife again. She knew these roads well. She had grown up in a neighboring county and understood their curves and shadows like the lines on her own hands. As the afternoon light fought against gathering clouds, she thought of her elderly mother and plans to visit the next day. Then the rain arrived suddenly, like a curtain dropping, turning clear visibility into near blindness within seconds. She slowed down, switched on the wipers, and leaned forward. She was always careful. Always. That was when the truck appeared out of nowhere at the intersection, running the stop sign without slowing. The red Ford, driven by a white man in a baseball cap, clipped the front bumper of her sedan with such force that the car spun sideways. The airbag exploded. For a moment she could neither see nor breathe, only feel the vehicle sliding off the road and into a shallow ditch. When everything finally stopped, she sat still for a moment, taking stock. Her chest ached from the seatbelt, her nose burned from the airbag dust, but nothing seemed broken. She was all right. She pushed the deflated airbag aside and searched for the truck. It had stopped some distance away. The driver was watching her in the rearview mirror. Lena began to open the door, thinking they would exchange insurance information like civilized people. But the engine roared and the truck sped away, flinging gravel and rainwater in its wake. She managed to climb out and tried to run after it, despite her heels in the downpour. But the vehicle vanished around a curve within seconds. She stood there in the pouring rain, staring at her damaged government sedan, tilted in the muddy ditch, its front bumper crumpled, and felt a wave of frustration rise inside her. She pulled out her phone and dialed 911, reporting the hit and run, giving the location and a description of the truck. The dispatcher, a woman with a strong Southern accent, told her an officer would arrive shortly and asked if she needed medical attention. Lena replied that she was fine, that she only needed to file a report and arrange for a tow. She waited beside her damaged car while the rain soaked her blazer and skirt. When the patrol car arrived, lights flashing through the storm, she felt relief. Help had come. Officer Bryce Harlan stepped out of his vehicle, and in that instant, everything changed. The moment his eyes landed on her, something hardened in his expression. His hand went straight to his weapon. His pale blue eyes narrowed as they swept over her. He did not ask if she was all right. He did not ask anything about the accident. Instead, he walked toward her with deliberate slowness, one hand on his gun, and said, "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" His tone carried no concern. It was suspicious, hostile, loaded with an assumption that made Lena's stomach tighten. She recognized that tone. She had heard it in countless interrogation recordings, in body camera footage, in victims' testimonies. It was the sound of a man who had already decided she was guilty of something. "I had an accident," she answered calmly, pointing to her car. "A truck ran the stop sign and hit me. I called to report it. The driver fled the scene." Harlan looked at her car, then back at her without changing his expression. "License and registration," he ordered. No pleas, no offer of help, just a dry, cutting command. Lena took a deep breath, keeping her composure. "Of course," she replied. "They're in my purse inside the car." She started toward the vehicle, but Harlan's voice cracked like a whip through the rain. "Stop right there. What did I tell you about moving?" Lena froze, confusion, and the first threads of real fear sliding through her chest. "I need to get my purse to give you my license," she explained, her voice still serene and professional. "It's on the front seat." Harlan's hand tightened on his weapon. "Put your hands on the hood of that car, now." This was wrong. Everything was wrong. But Lena had spent too many years in law enforcement not to know that arguing with an officer already in confrontation mode would only make things worse. She walked slowly to her car and placed her palms on the wet hood, the cold metal against her skin. "I'm a federal agent," she said quietly. "My credentials are in my purse, if you'll let me show them to you." Harlan let out a short, hard laugh with no trace of humor. "Sure you are," he said with scorn. "And I'm the president. What's your name?" "Lena Whitaker," she responded. Harlan returned to his patrol car and ran her license through the system. Lena waited with rain sliding down her face, hands still on the hood. She knew what he would find. Nothing useful. Her federal credentials were confidential. Standard police databases would show only that her driver's license was valid. They would reveal nothing of her position or rank. It was a security measure. But in that moment it worked against her. When Harlan returned, he seemed even more distrustful. "Your registration comes back weird," he said. "The vehicle is listed as government property, but there's no owner. That's suspicious. Very suspicious. This car is stolen." "It's a federal vehicle," Lena explained patiently. "Assigned to me by the FBI. My credentials are in my purse. I can show them to you." "You're not showing me anything until I say so," Harlan snapped. "I think you're under the influence. I'm going to administer a field sobriety test." "Walk that line," he said, pointing to the edge of the road. This was madness. She had called for help. She was the victim, yet now she was being treated like a criminal, standing in the rain, forced to perform sobriety tests when she had not touched alcohol in weeks. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job," Lena said, letting her training take control. Her voice was firm, calm, authoritative. "But I'm not under the influence of anything. Another vehicle hit me. I was the one who called 911. I'm the victim here, and I need to file a report so we can find the driver who fled." Harlan stepped forward, invading her space, his face inches from hers. "You've got an attitude problem," he whispered with venom. "You think you're better than me? You think you can tell me how to do my job?" "I'm not telling you how to do anything," Lena replied calmly. "I'm exercising my rights. I do not consent to a sobriety test. I wasn't drinking. Another driver hit me. That's why I called for help." The fury that crossed Harlan's face was sudden and terrifying. Before Lena could react, he grabbed her arm, twisted it behind her back, and slammed her against the hood of the car with such force that the breath left her lungs. A sharp pain shot through her shoulder. She cried out more from shock than pain, and heard another vehicle pull up behind them. Backup had arrived. Officer Mateo Rivera, a young Hispanic man, stepped out of his patrol car with his body camera already recording. He took in the scene, and discomfort showed immediately on his face. "Everything okay here, Harlan?" he asked cautiously. "Shut up, Rivera," Harlan barked. "The subject is resisting arrest." "I'm not resisting anything," Lena said, her voice strained by the pressure on her arm. But Harlan was not listening. He pulled out plastic zip ties and secured her wrists behind her back with rough efficiency, tightening them so forcefully that the plastic bit into her skin. Lena knew restraint techniques. She knew this was unnecessary. She knew he was doing it to hurt her, to humiliate her. Rivera took a step forward. "Sir, maybe we should verify her identification first. She says she's law enforcement." Harlan whirled on the young officer. "Are you questioning me, Rivera? You've been on the force how many months? You think you know more than I do?" He spat. Rivera hesitated, then stepped back, but his body camera kept recording. Lena felt the full weight of her powerlessness in that moment, for the first time in her distinguished career. Despite all her authority, her training, everything she had achieved, she felt real, deep, paralyzing fear. She was forced to kneel on the wet asphalt. The rain mixed with blood from her split lip, the same blow she had received when Harlan shoved her against the car. The pain of the zip ties cutting into her wrists was intense. The plastic was so tight she could already feel her fingers going numb. She remained on her knees in her ruined cream blazer and skirt, the clothes she had worn that morning for a meeting with the Attorney General, now soaked, dirty, caked with mud. The cold seeped into her bones. Rivera stayed close, his young face marked by unease, his camera capturing every second, yet unable to stop what was happening. Harlan moved around the car like a predator circling prey, yanking doors open, pulling out her belongings, and throwing them onto the flooded pavement. Her briefcase landed with a splash. Documents scattered. Her travel bag was opened and emptied. Clothes lay in the mud. He searched the glove compartment, the center console, the trunk. When he found her purse, he dumped it onto the hood. Lena watched her FBI credentials fall out, those she had carried for decades, bearing the seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and her official title, along with her wallet, phone, and keys. Harlan slowly picked up the leather credential case, opened it, and Lena waited for the moment of recognition, the moment he would realize the catastrophic mistake he was making. Inside were her official FBI badge and her identification card, with her photograph, signature, and the clear title: Director, Federal Bureau of Investigation. There was no way to mistake what it was, what it meant, who she was. But instead of shock or horror, instead of immediate apologies and the release of her bonds, Harlan's expression hardened further. He studied the credentials for a long moment, rain pelting the leather, then looked at her with something like triumph. "Nice try," he said. "Very good, but this is fake." Lena stared at him in disbelief. "I said this is fake," Harlan repeated, holding up the credentials. "You can buy things like this for $50 on the internet. People like you do it all the time. They think they can flash a fake badge and get away with it, but not in my county. Not people like you." The words hung heavy in the air. Rivera stepped forward, his voice trembling but firm. "Sir, that looks pretty official. Maybe we should call the FBI office in Atlanta and verify her identity." "I don't need to verify anything," Harlan replied brusquely. "I know a fake when I see one, and now she's going down for impersonating a federal officer. That's a federal crime, Rivera. A serious one. Maybe you'd know that if you paid attention during training instead of being so soft on suspects." Rivera's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. The toxic dynamic between them was clear. Harlan was the veteran with many years on the force. Rivera was the rookie still on probation, still afraid to step out of line. The culture of the department, the code of silence, the fear of being labeled disloyal, all of it showed in Rivera's conflicted face. He knew this was wrong, but he felt powerless to stop it. Lena had seen this dynamic countless times in her career. She had investigated departments where good officers looked the other way, while bad ones acted with impunity. She had read reports, watched footage, interviewed victims and agents. But living it herself, being the victim while a good officer watched helplessly, was different. It was visceral and terrifying in a way no report had prepared her for. Cars slowed as they passed, drivers craning their necks. A black teenager in a beat-up Honda stopped at the intersection, phone in hand, clearly recording. Harlan noticed and ran toward the car, shouting, "Keep moving. This is official police procedure. You record me, I'll arrest you too." The boy's eyes widened, and he drove off quickly. But Lena knew the video was already uploading. Somewhere, someone would see it. And that gave her a small spark of hope. Harlan grabbed her arm with a grip that would leave bruises and forced her to her feet. "You're going to the station," he said, "and then you're going to jail. Let's see how tough you are." He pushed her into the back of his patrol car. The metal grate separated her from the front. The smell of old vinyl and sweat filled her nose. Through the grate, she saw Harlan's satisfied smile in the rearview mirror. Rivera followed in his own car. Lena watched his face in the side mirror, tight with concern, knuckles white on the wheel. She tried to catch his eye, to silently urge him to be brave, to speak up, to do what was right, even if it was hard. But the distance made connection impossible. Then Harlan picked up the radio, and Lena's blood ran cold. "Unit 7 here," he said into the transmitter. "Transporting a black female suspect, multiple charges including impersonation of a federal officer, assault on an officer, violent and non-cooperative. Request she be placed in general population, not holding. She needs to learn some respect for the law." The implication was clear and terrifying. General population meant sending her straight in with regular inmates, not the safer holding cells. He was doing it deliberately, hoping one of the inmates would assault her, that they would teach her a lesson. It was not merely an abuse of power. It was an intentional attempt to cause harm to someone in custody. Lena had prosecuted cases exactly like this. She had seen officers charged with civil rights violations for the same conduct. That it was now happening to her felt unreal. Harlan looked at her in the rearview mirror. "You think you're special," he said with a crooked smile. "You think that fancy suit and that fake badge make you better than everyone else? You're going to learn real quick what happens to people who don't show proper respect to officers in this county. No one's going to believe you. No one's going to help you. Tonight you're going to learn your place." The cruelty in his voice was chilling. He was not a man overwhelmed by stress or making a mistake under pressure. He was a man who enjoyed the power he wielded over her, who found satisfaction in her helplessness. Lena had spent her career studying men like him. Harlan fit every pattern: the narcissism, the need for dominance, the barely concealed racism beneath a facade of professionalism. He was dangerous not in spite of his badge, but precisely because of it. Lena watched the familiar streets pass and thought of all the people who had felt that same powerlessness, who had sat in the back of patrol cars with wrists bound, full of fear, with no one believing them, no one helping them. She thought of all the reports she had read as director, all the statistics on racial disparities in arrests and use of force. She had always known intellectually that these things happened. She had dedicated her career to fighting them, but now she knew them in the deepest part of her body, in the pain of her shoulders, in the cut of the plastic on her wrists, in the metallic taste of blood in her mouth. She knew what it felt like to be powerless before an authority that had already decided she was guilty simply because of the color of her skin. At the sheriff's department, Harlan dragged her through a side entrance, avoiding the main lobby where someone might see her. The institutional smell hit her at once, industrial disinfectant failing to mask fear, sweat, and unwashed bodies. the unmistakable scent of places where freedom ends and confinement begins. Harlan's grip on her arm was unnecessarily violent, fingers digging into her bicep hard enough to bruise. Lena stumbled slightly in her heels, and he yanked her upright without gentleness. At the booking desk stood Deputy Carla Simmons, a white woman of middle age with steel-gray hair in a tight bun. She looked up, and upon seeing Lena, her expression shifted to something between contempt and revulsion. She did not see the FBI director or a victim who had asked for help. She saw what Harlan wanted her to see: a black woman in custody, soaked and bloodied, guilty before proven otherwise. "What do we have here, Harlan?" Simmons asked with a strong Southern accent, her tone suggesting this was routine. "Reckless driving, resisting arrest, assault on an officer, and possession of fraudulent federal identification," Harlan listed. "Claims she's with the FBI, none other than the director of the FBI." Simmons raised her eyebrows and looked at Lena with amusement. "Well, well, we have a celebrity among us." The mockery was evident. Lena tried to speak, to explain, to demand her rights. But Harlan cut her off. "Save it," he said coldly. "You'll have your chance to tell your lies later." "I have a right to a phone call," Lena replied firmly. "I know my rights." "You'll make your call when we're ready," Simmons responded, turning back to her computer. "First, we have to process you. We can't let inmates make calls before we know who they are." But they did know who she was. Her credentials held her name, her position, everything. They were simply choosing not to know, choosing not to check, choosing to proceed because it fit their narrative, because it gave them power, because they could. Lena was ordered to remove her jewelry. She watched Simmons roughly pull off her wedding ring, the band Julian had placed on her finger many years ago, and drop it into a manila envelope. Next came her watch, a gift from a previous FBI director. As it was yanked from her wrist and logged like evidence of a crime, Simmons remarked, "Nice watch. Where did someone like you get something like that?" The implication was clear. "A gift," Lena answered quietly. "Sure it is," Simmons replied with contempt. "I'm sure you have a whole story for that, just like the story about being FBI director, right?" She laughed. Harlan laughed with her. Lena felt humiliation burn inside her like acid. Then came the photograph. The camera flash blinded her under the harsh fluorescent light, capturing her split lip, rain-soaked clothes, and a gaze mixing fury and fear. Fingerprints followed. Simmons pressed each finger to the scanner with unnecessary force. When it came time for the body search, Simmons told Harlan to wait outside and led Lena to a small room. The search was invasive and degrading, performed with intentional roughness. Throughout, Simmons made comments about Lena's clothes, her appearance, her body. "Nice suit," she said, running fingers over the blazer fabric. "Designer, right? Where did you really get it? What did you have to do to get it?" The insinuation made Lena's skin crawl. "I bought it," she answered through gritted teeth. "With money earned during decades of federal service." "Decades," Simmons repeated with a mocking laugh. "In the FBI, right? And I'm the Queen of England." She finished and handed Lena an orange jumpsuit. "Put this on. Your fancy clothes will be stored with your belongings. Though if you go to general population like Harlan wants, you might not see them again. Things tend to disappear." Lena changed into this prison uniform, hands trembling. When she emerged, Simmons was waiting to escort her to a cell. But before they could leave the booking area, voices rose in the hallway. Rivera was arguing with Harlan. The words filtered through the half-open door. "We have to verify her identity," Rivera said, voice tight. "Those credentials looked authentic. What if she really is who she says she is? What if we're making a huge mistake?" "Are you questioning me?" Harlan's voice was low and dangerous. "Because it seems like you're questioning me, Rivera, and that's not going to do you any good. You're still on probation. I can have you fired at any time in the first year. For any reason. Do you understand what I'm telling you? The threat was direct. Obey or lose your job. Rivera fell silent. Lena heard his footsteps walking away, defeated. The system had just swallowed the conscience of another good officer. The culture of silence and self-protection had won again. Simmons led Lena down a hallway past cells, where other inmates watched with curiosity, disdain, or indifference. They did not stop. They continued toward the back, toward the section marked General Population, where long-term inmates waited, where Harlan wanted her to be, where he thought she would learn her lesson. Lena's heart pounded, but she kept her head high. Her training screamed, "Stay alert. Stay aware. Survey." Then the front doors of the station burst open with such force that the glass rattled. Heavy footsteps echoed, rapid, determined, full of purpose. Simmons stopped and turned. Lena did the same. Striding through the booking area with badge held high and face transformed by fury was Julian Whitaker, her husband, the county police chief. He had been trying to reach her when she did not answer her phone. When the car's emergency system sent a location signal and she still did not respond. When GPS showed she was at the station, but she remained unreachable. Julian realized something was terribly wrong. He had tracked her using the security app they shared. He had driven straight to the station with his mind flooded by horrible possibilities. Now he stood in the middle of the booking area, looking at his wife in an orange jumpsuit, blood on her face, marks from the zip ties on her wrists. Julian's eyes swept the room in one instant, taking in his wife in custody, her condition, Simmons's expression shifting from self-satisfaction to horror. Harlan, who had just emerged from his office, did not recognize him. The chief rarely visited the sheriff's department, and when he did, he usually came in civilian clothes. Jeans and a button-down shirt, no uniform. To Harlan, he was simply another angry black man, out of place. "And who the hell are you?" Harlan snapped. "This is official business. You need to leave right now." Julian slowly reached into his pocket, pulled out his badge and identification, and held them up for everyone to see. "I'm Police Chief Julian Whitaker," he said with deadly calm, the tone Lena knew well, his most dangerous one. "And I want to know who put my wife in custody." Silence fell. Absolute silence. Everyone in the room understood instantly that the world had just turned upside down. Simmons stepped back, face ashen. Rivera, drawn by the commotion, showed a mixture of relief and panic. But it was Harlan's face Lena watched. What she saw was not immediate remorse or horror at the mistake. She saw calculation, a man evaluating his next move, still searching for a way to justify himself, to escape the consequences. Then Julian spoke again. His eyes landed on his wife, on the visible marks of abuse, and his voice grew even colder. "That is FBI Director Lena Whitaker," he said. "And someone is going to explain to me right now why she is in custody, why she is injured, and why she is wearing a general population uniform instead of being in a holding cell." The impact rippled through the room like an electric shock. Simmons gasped and brought a hand to her mouth. Rivera's posture reflected relief and vindication, his earlier suspicions confirmed. Two deputies who had entered to see what was happening stood paralyzed, expressions shifting from curiosity to horror. But even facing this revelation, Harlan could not stop himself. "I didn't know," he stammered, though his tone sounded more like defense than genuine remorse. She didn't identify herself properly. She had an attitude. "I had reasonable suspicion the vehicle was stolen. The credentials looked fake." "Her credentials are authentic," Julian interrupted, voice slicing through the excuses. "They were issued by the FBI. They have security features and were in her purse, the same one you illegally searched." Julian walked to the booking desk where Lena's belongings still lay, damp from the rain. He picked up her credential case, opened it, and held it up for everyone to see. This is real. This is official. And if you had taken even a moment to look at it carefully instead of making assumptions, you would have known. Harlan's face flushed red. She didn't cooperate, he said stiffly. She refused a sobriety test. She was acting suspiciously. Acting suspiciously? Julian repeated, control cracking. She was the victim of a hit and run. She called 911 for help, and you arrested her. Julian turned to Rivera. Officer Rivera, I want to see the recording from your body camera right now. Rivera moved immediately to a computer terminal, connected the camera, and opened the files. Everyone gathered around the screen as the video began. The evidence was damning. It showed Lena standing calmly beside her damaged vehicle in the rain, explaining what had happened. It showed Harlan approaching with his hand on his weapon from the first moment, treating her like a threat instead of a victim. It showed Lena being professional and respectful, asking only that he check her credentials. It showed his refusal, his mockery, his growing hostility. It showed him violently shoving her against the car when she tried to explain her rights. It showed the zip ties tightened so brutally that the video captured her grimaces of pain. It showed the illegal search of her vehicle without consent or probable cause. It showed Harlan examining the FBI credentials and declaring them fake without any basis. It showed, word for word, him saying, "People like you." The footage exposed every moment of racial prejudice, every instance of excessive force, every violation of her constitutional rights. And most importantly, it proved Lena had never resisted, had never been violent, had never given him a legitimate reason to arrest her. The room remained in dense silence as the video reached the moment when Harlan called the station requesting she be sent to general population. When it ended, Julian turned to him with icy fury. "You put your hands on the FBI director," he said in a low, contained voice. "You violated her civil rights. You falsely arrested her and attempted to put her in danger by requesting she be sent to general population." He paused, letting the weight sink in. "And all of that," he added glacially, "is captured on video." Harlan's face went from red to white. He looked around for support, but no one met his gaze. Even Simmons had stepped back, trying to distance herself from what she now understood was a catastrophe. "I was just doing my job," Harlan muttered without conviction. "I had reasonable suspicion. I made a field decision. Officers have discretion." "Yes," Julian nodded. "Officers have discretion, but you didn't use discretion. You used prejudice." His voice cut with surgical precision. "You saw a black woman and assumed criminality. You saw credentials that contradicted your prejudices and called them fake because you couldn't imagine a black woman could hold the position of FBI director." "That's not true," Harlan protested, voice trembling. "I would have done the same no matter the race." "Then why didn't you verify her identity?" Julian replied harshly. "Why didn't you take a moment to call the FBI office in Atlanta? Why didn't you check the security features on her credentials? Why didn't you let her explain? And why did you escalate to force when she was completely cooperating?" Harlan had no answer. The silence that followed spoke louder than words. Rivera spoke then, low but firm. "Sir, I tried to suggest we verify her identity. Officer Harlan refused. He threatened my position when I questioned his judgment." Julian nodded slowly. "Thank you, Rivera. Your honesty is noted." Then he turned to Simmons. "I want those zip ties removed from my wife immediately, and every injury she has sustained documented." Simmons, pale, hurried to obey. She cut the zip ties still binding Lena's wrists. When the plastic fell, everyone saw the deep red marks, the skin broken where the plastic had dug in. Lena rubbed her wrists with a grimace of pain. Julian was at her side instantly, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, a crack showing in his professional composure. "I'm okay," Lena answered, though her voice trembled slightly. "I'm okay now." But nothing about this was okay. Julian pulled out his phone and dialed. "This is Police Chief Whitaker. I need the sheriff here immediately. We have a situation that requires his personal attention." Then he made another call, this time to the FBI's assistant director. "Theo, it's Julian. Listen carefully. Lena was assaulted and falsely arrested by an officer in this county. She's safe now, but we need a civil rights investigation team here immediately. Federal response." He listened, then added firmly, "Yes, I'm serious. Bring them now." While Julian made calls, Lena remained in the booking area, still in the orange jumpsuit, finally free of the restraints, beginning to process what came next. She was no longer just a victim. She was the FBI director, and a federal officer had been assaulted and had her civil rights violated by local police. This was now a federal case, to be investigated with every resource available. But before returning fully to her professional role, before giving orders, she needed one thing. "I want medical photographs," she said, voice now firm and authoritative, the voice of someone accustomed to command. "Document every injury, the marks on my wrists, the split lip, any bruises. I want statements from everyone present. I want the body camera recording preserved. I want the dash cam footage from Harlan's vehicle. I want his radio communications. Everything." Deputies hurried to obey, taking photographs with the department camera. The flash illuminated each injury with relentless clarity. The marks on Lena's wrists had turned from dark red to deep purple. Her lip was swollen and still bleeding. Bruises marked her arms where Harlan had grabbed her. When she lifted her blouse slightly, a boot-shaped mark showed on her lower back, the place where he had pressed her against the car. Every photograph was another piece of evidence. Every click of the camera, another nail in Harlan's coffin. Sheriff Raymond Holt arrived shortly after. A burly man in his 60s, he looked as if he might have a heart attack when he understood the magnitude of what had happened. He tried to apologize, to justify, to downplay, but Julian cut him off without hesitation. "Sheriff Holt, this is now a federal matter. The FBI will conduct a full investigation. I suggest you cooperate fully." Holt nodded, lips trembling, sweat on his forehead. "Of course. Whatever you need. This is terrible. Really terrible. I had no idea." "How could you have no idea?" Lena interjected, voice sharp for the first time, directed at the sheriff. "How many complaints have been filed against Officer Harlan before? How many times has he used excessive force? How many more people has he assaulted?" Holt's silence was answer enough. There had been complaints. There had been warnings. And no one had done anything. The pattern had been tolerated. Protected. Rivera, standing to the side, cleared his throat nervously. "Director Whitaker, there's something else. During the arrest, Officer Harlan turned off his body camera several times. It's against department policy, but he did it right when he was most aggressive. I think he knew he was crossing the line." That revelation changed everything. Intentionally disabling a body camera during a violent incident was not merely an administrative violation. In civil rights cases, it could be considered destruction of evidence and obstruction of justice. It demonstrated consciousness of guilt. It proved Harlan knew what he was doing was illegal. Lena and Julian looked at each other. They needed no words. Julian nodded, knowing exactly what came next. He walked to where Harlan stood, trying to make himself small in a corner. "Officer Bryce Harlan," Julian said formally, "you are under arrest." Harlan's face shifted from surprise to disbelief, to a bitter, defiant laugh. "You're arresting me? You can't arrest me. I'm a police officer. I was just doing my job. This is political. This is reverse discrimination. You're just protecting your wife." The accusations tumbled out in a desperate rush. The reflex of a man realizing the power he had wielded with such arrogance was now turning against him. Julian's face did not change. His voice remained steady and professional as he began reading the familiar rights. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The same words Harlan had spoken hundreds of times to other suspects now applied to him. The irony did not go unnoticed. The charges, Julian continued, are assault, battery, false imprisonment, violation of civil rights, and deprivation of rights under color of law. The last is a federal crime under Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 242. You used your position as a police officer to intentionally deprive Director Whitaker of her constitutional rights. Harlan's protests grew louder. This is crazy. This is a political witch hunt. You can't do this to me. I have rights. I want my union representative. I want a lawyer. You'll have both, Julian responded coldly. Right after you're processed, like any other suspect. Officer Rivera, please escort Officer Harlan to a holding cell. Rivera stepped forward, and the role reversal was complete. The young officer who had been intimidated into silence was now arresting his superior. He did it with professionalism, using handcuffs instead of zip ties, securing them firmly, but without cruelty. I'm sorry, sir, he said quietly. No one knew whether he apologized to Harlan for the arrest or to Lena for not intervening sooner. Harlan was led away, still protesting, his voice echoing down the hallway as he shouted about lawsuits, persecution, and how this would never hold up in court. The metallic slam of the cell door sounded like a period at the end of a sentence, marking the close of one chapter and the opening of another. Lena remained in the booking area, still wearing the orange jumpsuit, feeling the weight of everything settle over her like a lead blanket. She was safe now. Julian was there. Harlan was in custody. But the horror and trauma of those hours would not disappear easily. Her hands trembled slightly. The adrenaline was hitting now that immediate danger had passed. Julian noticed and gently guided her to a chair. Sit down, he said softly. Breathe for a moment. For a few brief instants, she allowed herself to be simply his wife, instead of the FBI director. She leaned lightly against him, feeling the solid, comforting warmth of his presence. But the moment could not last. She had work to do. In the hours that followed, Assistant Director Theo Ramirez arrived with a team of FBI agents specializing in civil rights violations. One look at Lena, still in the prison uniform, and his jaw tightened. Yet his voice remained professional. Ma'am, we're here, he said firmly. Tell us what you need. Lena stood, straightened her shoulders, and began giving orders with authority. She wanted all evidence secured. She wanted interviews with every witness. She wanted Harlan's personnel file, his complaint history, his training records, his evaluations. She wanted the department's policies on body cameras, use of force, and civil rights. She wanted to know if there were other victims, other cases, other patterns of abuse. The FBI team moved with impeccable efficiency. Although Theo gently suggested she rest and let them handle it, Lena refused. No, she said firmly. I'm the victim. Yes, but I'm also the director. This is my case too. I'm not stepping back. They began with the body camera recordings, not just Rivera's, but Harlan's as well. When they recovered Harlan's device and reviewed the files, they confirmed exactly what Rivera had mentioned. Multiple moments when the camera had been deliberately deactivated, timestamps matching precisely during the seconds when he shoved her against the car, when he tightened the zip ties, when he uttered his most direct threats. He knew, Theo murmured as he reviewed the files. He knew he was crossing the line and tried to hide the evidence. Lena nodded grimly. That makes it not just assault, but premeditation. He made conscious decisions to escalate the violence and then to cover it up. They continued with Harlan's personnel file. What they found was alarming. In his many years in the department, there had been 17 formal complaints against him for excessive use of force, racial profiling, verbal abuse, and improper searches. Some filed by citizens, others by defense attorneys on behalf of clients, and even one by a fellow officer who had since left the force. Of those 17 complaints, only 2 had resulted in any disciplinary action, both minor, a written reprimand, and a 2-day suspension without pay. The rest had been filed as unfounded, insufficient evidence, or simply closed without explanation. "This is a pattern," Lena said, voice tight with self-control. "Systemic abuse allowed to continue for years. Where was internal affairs? Where was oversight? Where was accountability?" Sheriff Holt, present during the review, had no convincing answers. He stammered about officer discretion, the difficulty of proving complaints, the union's role in protecting officers. Every excuse sounded hollow. Insufficient. Complicit. Julian, fists clenched so tightly it seemed he might punch through the wall, said, "I've been chief for some time, and I had no idea this was happening in the sheriff's department. I've been focused on my own people, on training and reform, but this," he gestured to the files scattered on the table, "this should have been confronted years ago." Lena took his hand briefly. "You can't fix everything everywhere," she told him gently, "but you can help fix this. Now." The FBI team spent hours interviewing everyone involved. Simmons tried to minimize her role, claiming she only followed Harlan's orders and did not know the truth. But the recordings and her own words during booking said otherwise. She had actively participated in the humiliation. She had made derogatory comments. She had been complicit in the abuse. She was not charged criminally, but she was suspended pending further investigation. Rivera offered a clear and honest account. He acknowledged not intervening more firmly, but explained the pressure he felt as a probationary officer, the threats to his career, the department culture that punished those who dared confront superiors. "I should have done more," he said, voice heavy with remorse. "I knew it was wrong from the first moment, but I was afraid of losing my job, of being called a snitch, of being fired. It's not an excuse, it's just the truth." Lena looked at him steadily. "Officer Rivera, the fact that you're honest about your failure is more than many others do. The fact that your camera kept recording when Harlan's didn't may have saved this case. I'm not justifying your silence, but I recognize your honesty now." They turned next to Harlan's phone, confiscated after his arrest. The forensic team unlocked it and found a treasure trove of evidence. There were text threads with other officers, in groups named the Real Police and the Blue Line Warriors, filled with racist memes, jokes about excessive force, and complaints about citizen oversight. The content was repulsive, revealing an internal subculture that viewed certain communities with contempt and certain suspects as less than human. In a message sent by Harlan on the day of the arrest, he had written, "Slow night. Hope I catch someone good to have some fun with. Need to blow off some steam." The premeditation was evident. He had been looking for a victim. Lena had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, driving while black in that county. The most incriminating discovery came when they recovered Harlan's prior employment records. Before joining this department, he had worked as an officer in another department 2 hours north. He had left under murky circumstances, described on forms as seeking new opportunities. When the FBI team contacted that department and requested his files under federal authority, they discovered Harlan had been under investigation some years earlier for excessive use of force and racial profiling. Multiple complaints had been filed. A federal civil rights investigation had been opened, then suddenly closed. No charges, no sanctions. Everything had been archived after the police union, and local politicians pressured, claiming the investigation was politically motivated and harmful to law enforcement. The FBI agent in charge had been reassigned. Harlan had resigned quietly and moved to a new department, carrying the same pattern of abuse with him. In the early hours, Lena sat in the conference room of the county sheriff's headquarters, surrounded by files and evidence reports. A cold, deep fury settled in her bones. This could have been avoided. Harlan should never have been on the streets. The earlier investigation should have ended with charges, dismissal, real accountability. Instead, the system had protected him. The police union had shielded him. Politicians had given him cover. He had continued moving from department to department like a predator seeking new hunting grounds. Lena thought of all the victims in between, of all the people who had suffered at Harlan's hands because the system failed to stop him. How many more traffic stops? How many more arrests? How many people humiliated, beaten, traumatized because accountability had been sacrificed for the image of law enforcement? The files showed at least 8 cases in this county alone where Harlan's conduct had been questionable. Those were only the cases with formal complaints. How many others had remained silent, too afraid or resigned to believe a complaint would accomplish anything? Theo Ramirez and Lena reviewed the same files with furrowed brows. "This goes beyond a single officer," he said quietly. "This is systemic, a department that protects its own no matter what they do. A pattern of behavior permitted and justified for years." Lena nodded. "That's why the investigation can't stop with Harlan. We need to review the entire department, its policies, training, complaint procedures, use of force statistics. We need to analyze every case Harlan was involved in and determine whether civil rights were violated. And we need to identify the other officers who participated in those message groups, who were part of this culture. That will take time," Theo warned. "It may generate resistance from the union and from politicians who see this as an attack on police." "I don't care," Lena responded without hesitation. "This is what we're going to do. This case will set a precedent. No more protection for bad officers. No more looking the other way. No more allowing officers to move from department to department carrying histories of abuse like luggage." Julian, who had remained silent in a corner, spoke with determined voice. "I'll fully support the investigation. Whatever you need." "Access, resources, personnel, you'll have it. And I'll push for reforms in my own department, body cameras that can't be turned off, stronger complaint procedures, better training on implicit bias. This ends here." In the days that followed, the investigation grew rapidly. FBI agents deployed throughout the county, interviewing residents, reviewing arrest records, documenting patterns. What they found was deeply alarming. Data showed clear racial disparities in traffic stops, arrests, and use of force. Black residents made up a significant portion of the population, but represented a disproportionately high share of traffic stops and arrests involving force. The numbers were stark and devastating. Community interviews revealed story after story of harassment and abuse. A retired black teacher named Evelyn Harper recounted how Harlan had stopped her while returning home from church. He accused her of speeding, despite her insistence she was within the limit. He made her wait under the sun for over an hour while checking her license, then ordered a sobriety test with no indication she was impaired, all while her students and their parents drove by, witnessing their teacher humiliated on the roadside. Evelyn filed a complaint, but it was archived as unfounded. A young black businessman named Malik Thompson described being stopped repeatedly outside his own business. Harlan would question what he was doing there, demand identification, claim he had received complaints about suspicious activity. When Malik explained he was the owner, Harlan demanded proof, ran his information, and made clear he did not believe a black man could legitimately own a successful business in that neighborhood. The harassment continued for months until Malik installed security cameras, recording the officer's visits, and threatened to sue. Only then did the stops cease. A 16-year-old named Darius Ellis described being beaten during a traffic stop. He was a passenger in a friend's car pulled over for a broken taillight. Harlan ordered them out, and when Darius asked why, interpreted the question as resistance. The boy was thrown against the car, arm twisted behind his back until his wrist sprained, then released with a warning about respecting authority. His parents wanted to press charges, but their lawyer warned it would be their black son's word against a white officer's, with minimal odds of success. So they stayed silent, filled with rage and helplessness. Until now. Each testimony added weight to the case against Harlan, but more importantly, exposed the systemic failure. Complaints had been filed, reports existed. Still, nothing changed. Evidence had been documented, but never acted upon. Internal Affairs had investigated superficially, but concluded lack of evidence, or accepted Harlan's explanations without question, or simply closed cases without proper review. The pattern was undeniable. Protect the officer, doubt the complainant, maintain the status quo. Media attention exploded. What began as a local story, the shocking arrest of an FBI director, became a national conversation about policing, accountability, and systemic racism. Major networks sent teams to the county. Lena gave several interviews, speaking with precision and calm about what had happened and what it represented. "I was lucky," she said in one, face serene despite bruises still visible on her wrists. "I have resources. I have authority. I have a platform. But what happened to me happens every day to countless people who don't have those things. And when it happens to them, no one listens. No one holds officers accountable. That has to change." When asked if she believed she had been targeted because of race, Lena did not hesitate. "Absolutely. Officer Harlan saw a black woman and assumed she was a criminal. He saw my federal credentials and refused to believe they were real because he couldn't imagine someone who looks like me could hold the position I hold. That is racism. That is implicit bias made explicit through action. And it's what millions of Americans face every day in interactions with police. Political pressure arrived almost immediately. Some politicians used the case to push police reforms, national standards on use of force, federal oversight of problematic departments, ending qualified immunity for officers who violated civil rights. Others reacted with fury, accusing the government and media of political exploitation, claiming it was an attack on law enforcement, that the vast majority of officers were good people, tarnished by one individual. Lena observed this political maneuvering with a cold, skeptical eye. She had spent too many years in Washington not to understand exactly how these things worked. Everyone wanted to use her story for their own agendas, but she was determined to keep focus on what mattered: justice and accountability. The Department of Justice intervened at the highest level. The Attorney General called personally to express support and assure her that every necessary resource would be available. But alongside words of support came carefully worded suggestions. Perhaps the case could be resolved quietly through a plea agreement, avoiding the spectacle of a public trial that might further inflame tensions around policing. Lena listened politely and rejected the idea firmly. "With all due respect," she said, "this case must be public. The evidence must be presented in court. The pattern must be entered into the public record. That's the only way anything changes. Resolving it quietly only allows the system to continue protecting the guilty. I will not be part of that." Her position as FBI director gave her power most victims never possessed. She could resist pressure that would silence others. She could demand accountability when others were asked to accept apologies and move on. She was determined to use that power not just for herself, but for all victims who came before and all who would face similar situations in the future. Julian remained her rock throughout. They spent long nights talking about complicity and reform, about how even good officers working inside a broken system end up perpetuating it. They spoke of the difference between individual prejudice and institutional racism. Julian struggled with guilt over what had happened under his jurisdiction, even though the sheriff's department did not report directly to him. "I should have known," he said one night on the porch of their home, finally back at their house. "I've been chief for some time. I should have known what was happening in the county. I should have reached out more. I should have coordinated better." "You can't fix everything everywhere," Lena reminded him gently. "But you're fixing what you can. And you defended me when it mattered most. You arrested a fellow officer. Do you know how rare that is? How many chiefs would have tried to cover it up or minimize it to protect the department's image?" Julian was silent for a long moment. "I almost did," he finally confessed. "For about 30 seconds when I walked in and saw the situation, a part of me was calculating how to minimize the damage, how to handle it discreetly. And then I saw your face, saw what he had done to you, and I knew there was only one right choice. But the fact that I even had that impulse to protect the institution before seeking justice, that's part of the problem too." Lena took his hand. "The fact that you recognized that impulse and rejected it," she said softly, "is what really matters. That's what reform means." "Reform," she said another night, as they sat in silence on the porch, "isn't just about changing policies. It's about changing culture, reflexes, automatic responses. It's about choosing justice over protection, accountability over solidarity." Their marriage, tested by trauma, ultimately grew stronger. They spoke more frankly than they had in years about race, policing, the complexities of being Black in America, and the unique challenges of being Black and part of law enforcement. Still, Lena began experiencing symptoms of trauma in the weeks after the arrest. She had nightmares about the gun barrel against her head, about the rain, about the helplessness of being bound and disbelieved. She startled at sudden noises. She drove in constant alertness, checking mirrors again and again, tensing whenever she saw police lights in the distance. Julian recognized the signs of post-traumatic stress and gently encouraged her to talk to someone, to process what had happened, instead of simply enduring it. She resisted at first. The stoic part of herself, the part that had survived decades in the FBI, insisted she could handle it alone. But she eventually agreed to see a therapist specializing in trauma, and the sessions began to help little by little. Lena started processing not only what had happened, but what it meant. How that incident had stripped away layers of authority and privilege built over decades, exposing her to the same brutal reality so many others faced every day. All of it, my title, my career, my connections, none of it protected me, she said in one session. The gun against my head was real, the fear was real, the powerlessness was real, and that was with more resources than almost anyone else. What does that say about everyone else? The therapist nodded calmly. It says the system is broken, she responded. But it also says you are in a unique position to help repair it. Not many people who have lived what you lived have the platform and authority to demand change. It became Lena's new purpose as she healed. She used her platform without reservation, speaking at conferences, writing op-eds, testifying before congressional committees. She was eloquent and forceful, using her experience as a living example of systemic racism in law enforcement, the need for accountability, and how power tends to protect itself at justice's expense. Sometime later, a federal grand jury handed down a formal indictment against Bryce Harlan. The charges were numerous and severe: deprivation of rights under color of law, a federal civil rights violation carrying up to 10 years in prison, assault, battery, false imprisonment under state law, obstruction of justice for turning off his body camera, and falsifying statements in official reports. The indictment was detailed, meticulously laying out every action, every abuse, every moment Harlan used his authority to violate the law he had sworn to uphold. Bail was denied. The federal prosecutor successfully argued Harlan posed a flight risk and potential danger to the community, citing his history of violence, the gravity of the charges, and the high likelihood of significant conviction. The judge agreed and ordered Harlan remain in federal custody pending trial. The irony did not go unnoticed. The same system he had fed with so many victims now held him behind bars without bail. His defense team, funded by the police union and supported by donations from law enforcement organizations nationwide, launched their strategy immediately. They filed motion after motion, attempting to exclude evidence and weaken the case. They argued body camera recordings should be dismissed because Rivera lacked explicit permission to record another officer. The motion was denied. They argued Lena's position as FBI director made her testimony inherently biased and the case politically motivated. That too was denied. They contended Harlan's text messages were private communications, protected from search. The judge rejected the argument, noting the messages were found during a legitimate investigation of a department-issued work phone. They even tried invoking qualified immunity, claiming Harlan acted in good faith based on training and experience. That motion was rejected outright, the judge declaring no reasonable officer could believe the conduct captured on video was legal. As pretrial hearings progressed, the defense strategy became clear. They would paint Harlan as a man who made a mistake. Yes, but an honest mistake under difficult circumstances. They would claim he felt threatened by Lena's attitude, that her resistance created reasonable suspicion. They would argue hindsight is perfect, and judging split-second decisions from a courtroom was unfair. Above all, they would insist Lena's race had nothing to do with it, that Harlan would have treated anyone the same way. The prosecution's strategy was the reverse. Let the evidence speak. They would present body camera recordings. They would show Lena's testimony alongside Rivera's and that of other citizens who suffered the same pattern of abuse. They would display Harlan's text messages, revealing his mindset and the internal culture in which he operated. They would introduce statistical data showing racial disparities in his arrests and use of force. They would demonstrate the pattern, the premeditation, the consciousness of guilt shown by deliberately turning off the camera, and prove this was not a bad day, but a career built on abuse of power. As the trial date approached, Lena threw herself into preparation. She reviewed every piece of evidence, participated in mock cross-examinations to anticipate defense attacks, and worked side by side with prosecutors to ensure the case was irrefutable. Theo Ramirez watched with concern. He feared she demanded too much of herself, that the weight of trauma and public exposure would eventually take its toll. "You should step back," he said gently. "Let the prosecutors handle it. You've already done more than enough." But Lena was firm. "I'm the victim," she said. "Yes, but I'm also a witness and the FBI director. I'm not staying on the sidelines. I'm seeing this through to the end." The personal cost was high. Sleep remained fragmented by nightmares. Constant media attention was exhausting. But she never wavered. Every interview centered on broader issues: accountability, systemic racism, abuse of power. She always ensured focus extended beyond her case to what it represented. Julian supported her unconditionally, but intervened when he saw her pushing too hard. One night, finding her in the dining room past midnight surrounded by files, eyes wide, he said calmly, "You don't have to carry all of this alone. You have a team. You have prosecutors. You have investigators. Let them do their work." "I'm letting them do it," Lena responded without looking up. "I'm just making sure nothing gets overlooked. This case is too important." "Every case is important to the victim," Julian replied softly. "But you're not just a victim. You're the FBI director, and you have responsibilities beyond this process. The Bureau needs you at full capacity. The country needs you focused on terrorism, on organized crime, on all the other threats you face. You can't let this consume you completely." Lena looked up. She saw the concern in his eyes, and for an instant her determination wavered. She knew he was right. There were other duties, other priorities. But this case was different. It was personal because she had lived it, because she felt in her bones what was at stake. "After the trial," she promised. "After we get the conviction, I'll stop. I'll take a break. We'll go on that trip we've been postponing, but not yet. Not until this was over." Julian nodded, knowing that battle had to be hers. He leaned in and kissed her forehead. "All right, but I'm going to keep reminding you to eat, sleep, and rest. That's my job." A week before trial, Harlan's attorney approached the prosecution with a proposal. Harlan wanted to plead guilty in exchange for reduced charges and a lighter sentence. It was tempting from a procedural standpoint. A guaranteed conviction, no unpredictable jury, enormous resource savings. The prosecution team debated, weighing certainty against the importance of a public trial. When they brought the proposal to Lena for her opinion as victim, she did not hesitate. "No," she said firmly. "No deal. We're going to trial." Lead prosecutor Michael Chen, a veteran with decades of experience in civil rights cases, raised his eyebrows. "Director Whitaker, trials are unpredictable. Juries can be swayed by good defense attorneys, by sympathy for police, by 1,000 factors. A deal guarantees accountability and a criminal conviction." "A deal lets him minimize what he did," Lena responded with force. "It lets him pretend it was a mistake instead of facing his pattern of abuse. It gives the system the opportunity to avoid full public examination. And most importantly, it sends the message that if you abuse your authority long enough and hurt someone with enough power, you can still negotiate your way out of consequences." She leaned forward, eyes burning with determination. "I want a full trial. I want every piece of evidence presented to the public. I want the jury to see the body camera recording, to hear from the other victims, to understand this wasn't an isolated incident. I want the jury to see that good officers can stand up to bad ones. I want this entire case part of the public record without omissions. And if we lose," she asked quietly, "then we appeal. We keep fighting. But at least we'll have told the full truth. At least the evidence will be public. At least people will know what happened and can judge the system's response for themselves. I'd rather take that risk than accept a quiet deal that changes nothing." Chen watched her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "All right, we're going to trial. But you need to understand the pressure you'll face. The defense will come at you with everything. They'll question your credibility, your motives, your memory. They'll try to portray you as someone using your position to get revenge on an officer who was just doing his job. It will be brutal." "I've testified in hundreds of cases," Lena responded calmly. "I've faced cross-examination from some of the best defense attorneys in the country. I can handle it." "This is different," Chen warned. "This time you're the victim. This time it's personal. They'll try to break you emotionally." Lena remembered the cold gun barrel against her head, the boot pressing into her back, the plastic cutting into her wrists. "He already tried to break me," she said quietly. "He failed. His lawyers won't succeed where he didn't." The message reached Harlan's attorney. No deal. Trial would proceed as scheduled. In the days leading to jury selection, media coverage reached a boiling point. Legal analysts debated case strength, witness credibility, likelihood of conviction. Some predicted crushing victory, given video evidence, and Lena's reputation. Others warned juries often hesitate to question police, that the defense could sow reasonable doubt, that Harlan could walk free. Lena watched the reports with distant curiosity, understanding everyone used her case for their own purposes, talking about policing, race, justice, politics. But she also understood this was how change happened. Through public pressure, sustained attention, forcing systems to confront failures under relentless social scrutiny. The night before jury selection, Lena and Julian sat once again on their porch, looking out at the lake that many years earlier had seemed a refuge of peace. It felt as if an entire lifetime had passed since that rainy afternoon when a truck ignored a stop sign and set everything in motion. "Are you ready?" Julian asked. "As ready as I can be," Lena answered. "Tomorrow everything begins, and whatever happens, at least we'll have tried. At least we'll have fought for accountability. That has to be worth something." Julian squeezed her hand. "It is worth everything," he said softly. "Win or lose, you're doing what should have been done years ago. You're raising your voice. You're using your power not to protect yourself, but to change a system. That's what leadership means." Lena squeezed back and allowed a small smile to soften her face. "Let's hope the jury sees it that way too." The trial began on a cool morning. The federal courthouse was filled to capacity. Overflow rooms with monitors were packed. Security was extreme. Metal detectors, long lines, federal marshals on every corner. Media attention was unprecedented for a local civil rights case. But this was no longer local. It had become a national symbol, a test case on whether the system could truly hold itself accountable. Jury selection took 2 full days. The defense used challenges aggressively, striking any potential juror with strong opinions about police reform or personal experience with police abuse. The prosecution struck anyone showing blind deference to authority or inability to acknowledge racial bias in law enforcement. The result was a jury of 12, diverse in race, age, and background. 6 women, 6 men, 4 black, 3 white, 3 Hispanic, 2 Asian. A true cross-section of America tasked with delivering justice. Prosecutor Michael Chen opened with a precise, meticulous presentation. He laid out what evidence would show. Officer Harlan saw a black woman and immediately assumed criminality. He ignored her clear credentials. He escalated to violence without justification. He attempted to cover up by turning off his body camera and falsifying his report. Chen played a brief clip, barely 30 seconds, showing Harlan shoving Lena against her car while she calmly explained she was a federal officer. The jury's reaction was immediate. Several flinched. An elderly black woman shook her head softly. Defense attorney Richard Brennan, a veteran with an impeccable reputation defending police officers, took a completely different approach. He acknowledged the incident was unfortunate. Mistakes were made. Director Whitaker should not have been treated that way. But he presented it as a series of misunderstandings and split-second decisions, not deliberate abuse. He highlighted Harlan's many years of service, dangers officers face daily, difficulty making correct decisions under pressure. He painted Lena as uncooperative, someone who disobeyed legitimate orders and created conditions leading to confrontation. He planted the idea that her position and power were being used to exact revenge on an officer simply doing his duty. The prosecution's case unfolded methodically over the following week. They began with Rivera, whose testimony was crucial. The young officer described the scene when he arrived. Lena cooperative and professional, Harlan aggressive and hostile from the first moment. He recounted trying to suggest verifying her identity and being threatened into silence. He described witnessing the escalation with growing horror. On cross-examination, Brennan attempted to portray Rivera as disloyal, betraying a fellow officer to save his career. But Rivera stood firm. "I'm not disloyal to good officers," he said clearly. "I'm loyal to the truth, and the truth is that what Officer Harlan did was wrong. I should have done more to stop it, and I'll regret that forever. But I'm not going to compound that mistake by lying now." The full body camera recording, from Rivera's arrival until Lena's arrest, was played. The courtroom watched in silence as the video showed exactly what happened. There were no ambiguities, no room for interpretation. Lena had been calm, professional, cooperative. Harlan had been aggressive, hostile, violent. When the segment appeared where he deliberately turned off his camera, several jurors leaned forward, expressions hardening. Then came Lena's testimony. She took the stand in a sober navy suit. Her bearing was professional and serene, though a slight tremor in her hands as she took the oath betrayed nerves. Chen led her through the facts of that day: the accident, the hit and run, her 911 call. She described Harlan's arrival, his immediate hostility, her attempts to de-escalate and identify herself. She recounted the physical violence, the pain of the zip ties, the boot on her back. She told of the gun barrel pressed to her head, and the absolute terror of that moment, the certainty she could die. Her voice remained steady, but her eyes glistened with held-back tears as she described kneeling in the rain, helpless and afraid. "I've spent decades in law enforcement," she said. "I've faced armed suspects, terrorists, organized crime figures. I've testified in hundreds of cases, but I never felt as powerless, as frightened, as dehumanized as I did in that moment. Not because of the physical danger, though it was real, but because the person hurting me was supposed to be there to protect me, because I did everything right, and it didn't matter. Because I knew that if I didn't have the position I have, if I didn't have the resources I do, no one would believe me. No one would help me. And that certainty was terrifying." Cross-examination was brutal, exactly as Chen warned. Brennan tried every angle. He questioned whether Lena had been cooperative enough, whether she gave Harlan reason to feel threatened, whether trauma distorted her memory. He pointed out she refused the sobriety test, framing it as disobedience rather than legitimate exercise of constitutional rights. He even suggested her position as FBI director gave her an inflated sense of authority Harlan might have interpreted as threat. But Lena held firm. She answered every question calmly, without losing control or raising her voice, always returning to facts. When Brennan suggested she exaggerated the violence, she simply pointed to enlarged photographs on screens before the jury. The deep marks on her wrists, the split lip, the boot-shaped contusion on her back. When he implied race played no role, Lena explained with serenity how Harlan's behavior from the first moment followed the same pattern of racial profiling she had investigated in dozens of cases during her career. Then other victims testified. Evelyn Harper, the teacher humiliated before her students. Malik Thompson, the businessman harassed outside his own business. Darius Ellis, the teenager beaten during a traffic stop. Each story reinforced the last, establishing a clear pattern of racial prejudice and excessive force. Each came backed by documentation, official complaints, injury photographs, witness statements. The pattern was undeniable. Brennan tried to discredit each victim, suggesting hidden motives, questioning memories, pointing out none of their complaints resulted in sanctions for Harlan as proof they were unfounded. But the accumulated weight of their words was devastating. This was not an isolated mistake. It was an entire career built on abuse. Then the prosecution presented Harlan's text messages, and they were devastating. Racist memes, jokes about teaching respect. The message in the Blue Line Warriors group on the day of arrest: "Slow night. Hope I catch someone good to have some fun with. Need to blow off some steam." The jury read in silence. Several showed expressions of disgust. Brennan protested vehemently, arguing the messages were prejudicial and not directly related to the specific incident. But the judge admitted them as evidence of state of mind and pattern of conduct. Expert witnesses took the stand to contextualize. They spoke about implicit bias in policing, statistics on racial disparity in stops and arrests, the culture of silence protecting abusive officers. They situated Harlan's actions within a broader framework, demonstrating how individual prejudices thrive, thanks to systemic failures that permit them. The defense responded with its own witnesses, fellow officers praising Harlan's professionalism, neighbors claiming he had helped them, use of force experts asserting his actions fell within acceptable parameters based on information available at the time. But under cross-examination, they all faltered. Officers defending him were confronted with their own messages in the same chat groups. Racist content, now public. Residents praising him turned out to be all white. None could recall seeing him interact with black people. The use of force expert admitted under pressure that turning off a body camera during violent confrontation was never acceptable under any circumstances. Harlan did not testify. Brennan made that decision clearly. He knew his client would not withstand cross-examination well. His best chance was letting the defense narrative float without direct scrutiny from the prosecutor. But his silence said more than words, and the prosecution capitalized on it in closing. The defendant had no explanation or justification he was willing to offer under oath, Chen told the jury. Closing arguments came in the third week. Chen spoke first. His argument was eloquent and devastating, tying every piece into a clear narrative of abuse, pattern, and consciousness of guilt. Officer Harlan saw a black woman and assumed criminality, he told the jury. He refused to look at her credentials because they contradicted his prejudices. He escalated to violence because she dared exercise her rights. He turned off his camera because he knew what he was doing was wrong, then tried to cover it up by falsifying reports and claiming her credentials were fake. This was not a mistake. It was not a misunderstanding. It was deprivation of civil rights under color of law, and the evidence proves it beyond reasonable doubt. Brennan based his argument on the difficulty of police work. He spoke of split-second decisions officers must make, of the luxury of hindsight jurors enjoy, but officers on the street do not. He painted Harlan as a dedicated public servant who made a judgment error, not a crime. Yes, Director Whitaker should not have been arrested, he conceded. Yes, Officer Harlan made mistakes, but mistakes are not crimes. Show him the same compassion you would want if judged for your worst moment. The jury deliberated for several hours, hours that felt like days to those waiting. Lena sat with Julian, Theo Ramirez, and the prosecution team, trying to focus elsewhere, but unable. Every phone vibration from the court clerk made her heart race, but updates were minor. The jury wanted lunch. They wanted to review evidence. They had a question for the judge. Finally, in the afternoon, the message arrived, verdict reached. The courtroom filled again. Same crowds, same media presence, same unbearable tension. Lena sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, Julian at her side, hands clasped tightly. Harlan sat at the defense table, face carefully neutral, hands trembling slightly. The jury entered, faces unreadable. The judge asked the foreperson if they had reached a verdict. Yes, Your Honor. On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, how do you find the defendant? Guilty. The word hung in the air an instant. Then a wave of reactions rippled through the room. Some sighed. Others murmured. Someone in the back began applauding, but the judge silenced it immediately. Lena felt Julian's hand squeeze hers. Her own heart pounded hard, but she kept her face serene. Verdicts continued. Guilty of assault. Guilty of battery. Guilty of false imprisonment. Guilty of obstruction of justice. Guilty of falsifying official reports. Guilty on every count. Harlan's face turned pale. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, but there was nothing to say. Evidence had been overwhelming. Verdict just. The judge thanked the jury for service and set sentencing for 3 weeks later. Harlan was returned to custody, escorted out by federal marshals. For the first time since the incident, Lena allowed herself to feel something close to relief. Outside the courthouse, she offered a brief statement to gathered media. "Justice was served today," she said simply. "But this case was never just about me. It was about every person who has suffered abuse at the hands of those sworn to protect them. It was about accountability and the rule of law. Today's verdict sends a message. Wearing a badge does not mean immunity. Civil rights matter, and abuse of power will be prosecuted. But a verdict is not enough. We need systemic reform. We need to change the culture that allowed Officer Harlan's abuse to continue for years. We must ensure this never happens again." That work continues. 3 weeks later, the court reconvened for sentencing. Under applicable federal guidelines, the range was 5 to 7 years in prison, but the judge had discretion to increase or decrease based on aggravating or mitigating factors. Both sides presented extensive arguments. The prosecution asked for maximum, citing gravity of abuse, pattern of conduct, betrayal of public trust, and need for deterrence. The defense requested leniency, invoking Harlan's years of service, lack of prior criminal record, impact on family, and expressions of remorse. Lena had opportunity to present a victim impact statement. She had thought carefully about what to say, aware her words would carry weight not only before the judge, but before the public following the case, as symbol of a broader problem. She stood before the bench, looked directly at Judge Patricia Morrison, a black woman in her 60s, with 2 decades on the federal bench, and began, "Your Honor, when Officer Harlan pressed a gun to my head and forced me to kneel in the rain, he did much more than violate my civil rights," Lena said, voice firm and clear. "He demonstrated the reality millions of Americans face, that the color of their skin makes them suspects, that their rights are conditional, that systems designed to protect them can become instruments of oppression. I was fortunate. I had resources, authority, a platform. Most victims don't have that luck. Most suffer in silence, their complaints ignored, their wounds dismissed, their trauma minimized. This case is about much more than one officer's actions. It's about a system that protected him for years, despite repeated complaints. It's about a culture that values loyalty over accountability. It's about countless victims who never had their day in court." She paused, ensuring next words resonated fully. "I'm not asking for vengeance, Your Honor. I'm asking for justice. I ask that you send a clear message that abuse of power will be punished, that civil rights matter, that wearing a badge does not grant immunity. Officers who witnessed Harlan's abuses and remained silent must face consequences. Departments that protect abusers must face consequences. And above all, communities victimized for generations must see that the system can work, that accountability is possible, that their lives and rights have value." The judge listened attentively, then asked if Harlan wished to speak. He stood with his attorney and offered an apology that sounded rehearsed and hollow. "I regret what happened with Director Whitaker," he said. "I made mistakes that day. I let job stress affect my judgment. I never meant to hurt anyone. I hope the court shows mercy." Judge Morrison watched him a long moment, skepticism clear in her expression. Then she began speaking with measured but powerful words. "Mr. Bryce Harlan, you were a police officer for many years. You were entrusted with extraordinary power, the power to stop citizens, detain them, use force, even take lives when necessary. With that power comes equally extraordinary responsibility. You violated that responsibility not once, not by accident, but repeatedly and deliberately over years. Evidence showed a pattern of racial bias, excessive use of force, and abuse of authority. You saw Director Whitaker, a black woman, and made immediate assumptions about criminality. When confronted with evidence contradicting those assumptions, you rejected the evidence instead of questioning your own prejudice. You escalated to violence against a cooperative victim. You turned off your body camera to conceal your actions. You attempted to put her in danger by requesting general population placement, then falsified your reports. These are not the actions of an officer who had a bad day, the judge said, voice hardening. They are the actions of someone who should never have worn a badge. The victim's impact statement is compelling, she added. But even without it, I would impose a significant sentence. You betrayed your oath. You abused your authority. You violated the civil rights of citizens who trusted you to protect them. Guidelines recommend 5 to 7 years. I find that insufficient given the atrocious nature of your conduct, the pattern of abuse, and need for deterrence. This court sentences you to 12 years in federal prison, the maximum permitted under applicable statutes. Additionally, you are permanently barred from any law enforcement employment. You shall pay full restitution to Director Whitaker for medical and legal expenses and participate in therapy addressing your evident racial bias. 12 years. The courtroom filled with murmurs. Harlan's family in the back began to cry. But Lena felt no triumph, only that justice, at last and delayed, had been served. As marshals led Harlan away in handcuffs, the irony was complete. The man who so enjoyed putting her under his control was now the one processed, booked, and sent to prison. The system, for once, worked as it should. Consequences unfolded in the months that followed. The FBI investigation into the county sheriff's department culminated in a federal consent decree imposing comprehensive reforms, mandatory body cameras that could not be turned off, an independent civilian board to review complaints, mandatory implicit bias and de-escalation training, and federal oversight for 5 years. Several other officers, including Deputy Simmons, were fired or resigned under pressure. Sheriff Holt announced he would not seek re-election, ending his career in disgrace. Rivera was promoted to sergeant and became an active advocate for police reform, speaking at academies about the importance of speaking up when witnessing misconduct. Julian continued as police chief, implementing many of the same reforms in his own department and becoming a national voice for accountability in law enforcement. Lena returned to Washington transformed by the experience, but more committed than ever to using her position to fight for justice. She founded a new civil rights division within the FBI, dedicated specifically to police accountability, allocating resources to investigate problematic departments and support local reform efforts. She spoke frequently about her experience, always emphasizing that her case mattered not because of who she was, but because of what it represented. The story could have ended there. Justice served, reforms implemented, accountability, however relative. But sometime later, Lena received a letter at her FBI headquarters office. It was handwritten on lined paper in careful, neat handwriting from a young woman named Aaliyah Brooks. "Dear Director Whitaker," it began. "You don't know me, but I know you. I saw your case on the news. When I was 19, Officer Harlan stopped me while coming home after my shift at the restaurant where I worked to pay for community college. He said my taillight wasn't working, but that wasn't true. I'd had my car checked the week before. He made me get out, searched my vehicle without permission. He made comments about my appearance, about what I must have been doing out so late, about whether I had a boyfriend who could vouch for me. He threatened to arrest me for obstruction when I asked why he was stopping me. I was terrified. I called my mother crying while he sat in his patrol car running my license. He kept me there over an hour before letting me go with a warning about my attitude. I wanted to report him. I wanted to file a complaint. But my mother's lawyer told us it would be my word against his, that black girls like me don't win those cases, that fighting would only make things worse. So I stayed silent. I was angry, humiliated, but above all, powerless. I thought that's just how things were, that there was nothing I could do. Then I saw your case on the news. I watched you testify. I saw that officer convicted and sent to prison. And for the first time that night, I felt maybe justice was possible, that maybe speaking up was worth it, that maybe the system could work. Your case gave me courage I didn't know I had. I'm in law school now, Director Whitaker. I begin my first year at Howard next month. I'm going to be a civil rights attorney. I'm going to fight for people like us, people who have been hurt, humiliated, and told their voices don't matter. I'm going to make sure what happened to me, what happened to you, happens to fewer people in the future. I know one case, one conviction, doesn't fix everything. I know the system is still broken in many ways. But you showed me change is possible, that resistance matters, that justice can win sometimes. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for using your power and platform to fight. Thank you for showing me that even when the system tries to break you, you can break the system instead. I promise to honor your example by fighting for those who cannot fight for themselves. The letter was signed simply with gratitude and determination. Aaliyah Brooks. Lena read the letter 3 times at her desk, tears streaming down her face. For the first time since the trial, all the trauma, all the pain, all the exhausting road in search of justice suddenly made sense in a way even the verdict had not achieved. That young woman, that stranger, had found hope and courage because Lena refused to stay silent, refused a discreet resolution, and insisted on full accountability, despite personal cost. That night, Lena showed the letter to Julian. They sat together once again on the porch, in the same place where they had talked so often about the case, and Julian read it slowly. When he finished, he looked at his wife with deep love and respect. "This is why you did it," he said quietly. "This is why you rejected the plea deal. This is why you insisted on a public trial. This is why you kept going even when it hurt. Not just for justice in your case, but for all the Aaliyahs out there who needed to see the system could work." Lena nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Then she said, "One case doesn't fix everything. Harlan in prison doesn't erase years of abuse or prevent the next corrupt officer. But maybe it's a crack in the wall. Maybe it's proof accountability is possible. And through that crack, some light is getting in." She had the letter framed and placed it in her FBI headquarters office, right beside her credentials and badge, the same ones Harlan had called fake. Every day when she arrived at work, she saw it there. A reminder of why the fight mattered, of who she fought for, of the real impact justice, though incomplete and delayed, could have on individual lives. The system that tried to break her that rainy afternoon in the county had failed. She had broken through barriers, and in doing so, opened a path for others. That was not merely victory. It was transformation. The work continued. There were more cases, more investigations, more reforms to fight for. Institutional racism in policing was not solved by a single trial, no matter how significant. But Lena carried Aaliyah's letter as proof the fight was worth it. And every time the work became overwhelming, every time obstacles seemed insurmountable, every time she doubted whether any of it really made a difference, Lena would read that letter again. And remember, change happens one case at a time, one voice at a time, one person finding courage at a time. The question she asked herself every morning, and hoped others would ask themselves too, was simple but profound. When you see an injustice, will you look the other way, or will you stand up? Will you protect the system or demand it change? Will you use whatever power you have, however small, to make things better. Lena Whitaker had made her choice. She stood up. She demanded accountability. She used her power not to protect herself, but to create change for others. And in doing so, she demonstrated that even the most broken systems can be challenged, that even the most entrenched powers can be held accountable, that even the smallest crack in the wall can let in transformative light. That was the true end of this story. Not just a conviction, not just a sentence, but a young woman inspired to dedicate her life to fighting for justice, and many others who, seeing that fight, found their own courage. Have you ever witnessed an injustice and stayed silent because you felt you couldn't change anything? What would you do if you found yourself in Lena's situation, facing abuse from those supposed to protect you? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved you, like this video, and subscribe to hear more stories about courage, accountability, and the fight for justice. Share it with those who need to know that standing up matters, that their voices count, and that change is possible when we refuse to accept injustice. Thank you for watching, for caring, and for being part of this conversation about how we can build a more just society together. Remember, every voice matters, every action counts, and together we can create the change we need.